The disappearance of non-avian dinosaurs marks one of the most profound biological turning points in Earth's history. For decades, this event has often been summarized with a single explanation: an asteroid impact ended the age of dinosaurs. While this statement contains an important element of truth, it is not a complete scientific account. Modern paleontology does not treat the end Cretaceous extinction as a simple, single-cause catastrophe. Instead, it is understood as a complex process shaped by multiple environmental pressures acting across different timescales. Fossils, sediments, and geochemical signals show that life on Earth was already experiencing stress before the final boundary between the Cretaceous and Paleogene periods. The extinction event did not unfold in isolation, nor did it affect all organisms in the same way. Non-avian dinosaurs vanished entirely, yet many other groups survived. Crocodilians persisted, turtles endured, mammals passed through the boundary. A small lineage of feathered theropods survived and later diversified into modern birds. These uneven outcomes raise a fundamental scientific question: why did non-avian dinosaurs fail where others endured? This documentary examines that question by separating what can be demonstrated directly from the geological record from what must be inferred cautiously. It does not argue for a single cause, nor does it attempt to assign blame to one event alone. Instead, it explores how overlapping environmental stresses, biological constraints, and ecological collapse interacted to push non-avian dinosaurs beyond the limits of survival. The story that follows is not one of sudden annihilation, but of vulnerability accumulating over time, until a final disruption tipped already strained ecosystems into irreversible collapse. Among all proposed factors in the extinction of non-avian dinosaurs, one event is supported by particularly strong and direct evidence: a large asteroid impact at the very end of the Cretaceous period. This event is not inferred from fossils alone, but from multiple independent geological signals preserved across the planet. The most widely recognized evidence is a thin sedimentary layer enriched in the element iridium. Iridium is rare in Earth's crust, but relatively abundant in extraterrestrial objects, such as asteroids. This anomalous layer appears at the same stratigraphic level worldwide and coincides closely with the boundary marking the end of the Cretaceous. Its global distribution indicates a rapid, planet-scale deposition rather than a slow, local process. Additional confirmation comes from shocked quartz, mineral grains whose internal structure has been deformed by extreme pressures. Such pressures are not produced by volcanic eruptions or tectonic processes, but are characteristic of high-energy impacts. These shocked minerals are found in the same boundary layers as the iridium anomaly, strengthening the case for a sudden collision. The discovery of the Chicxulub crater provided the final piece of direct physical evidence. Buried beneath sediments on the Yucatan Peninsula, this crater measures roughly 180 kilometers in diameter and dates precisely to the end of the Cretaceous. Its size implies an impactor several kilometers wide, releasing an amount of energy far beyond any volcanic event in recorded Earth history. What this impact would have caused immediately is relatively well constrained.
Models indicate intense seismic activity, global wildfires triggered by re-entering ejecta, and massive tsunamis near coastlines. However, these short-term effects alone cannot explain the selective pattern of extinction seen in the fossil record. Many organisms survived the initial catastrophe, indicating that the most decisive consequences unfolded over longer timescales. The longer-term environmental effects are considered central. Vast quantities of dust, aerosols, and sulfur compounds would have been injected into the atmosphere. This material likely reduced sunlight reaching Earth's surface for months or even years.
Reduced sunlight would have disrupted photosynthesis, affecting plants and phytoplankton at the base of terrestrial and marine food webs. Evidence for a collapse in primary productivity appears in both marine microfossils and terrestrial pollen records. These data suggest a sharp decline in plant life following the boundary event. For large herbivorous dinosaurs, whose survival depended on continuous access to substantial amounts of vegetation, such a decline would have posed an immediate and severe challenge. Carnivorous dinosaurs would not have been insulated from this collapse. As herbivore populations declined, predators would have faced cascading shortages of food. Large body size, which had been advantageous in stable ecosystems, became a liability in an environment where energy availability was sharply reduced and unpredictable. It is important to emphasize what the asteroid impact explanation does and does not establish. The impact unquestionably occurred. It had global environmental consequences. It coincides in time with the extinction of non-avian dinosaurs. What it does not demonstrate on its own is that all dinosaurs died directly because of the impact, or that the impact acted in isolation from other environmental pressures already affecting ecosystems. Some groups survived the boundary event, including small vertebrates and certain reptilian lineages. Their survival indicates that the post-impact world, while harsh, was not universally lethal. This observation suggests that the asteroid acted as a trigger or amplifier rather than a sole cause. In scientific terms, the asteroid impact represents a necessary component of any explanation for the extinction of non-avian dinosaurs, but not a sufficient one by itself. It created conditions under which survival depended on flexibility, small size, rapid reproduction, and low energy requirements, traits that non-avian dinosaurs as a group largely lacked. Understanding the role of the impact is therefore a matter of recognizing both its power and its limits. It delivered an abrupt shock to Earth's systems, but the full story of dinosaur extinction requires examining how that shock interacted with longer-term environmental and biological vulnerabilities. Although the asteroid impact at the end of the Cretaceous is supported by strong physical evidence, it does not by itself fully explain the pattern of extinction observed in the fossil record. This limitation is not a weakness of the impact hypothesis, but a reflection of the complexity of mass extinctions as biological events. One of the first indications that the asteroid alone is insufficient comes from selectivity. The extinction at the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary did not eliminate all large animals, or reptiles, or even all dinosaurs. Non-avian dinosaurs disappeared entirely, yet several other groups with similar ecological roles or body plans survived.
Crocodilians persisted. Turtles crossed the boundary. Some lizards, amphibians, fish, and mammals survived and later diversified. Most notably, a lineage of small theropod dinosaurs, the ancestors of modern birds, endured. If the asteroid impact had acted as a single, universally lethal mechanism, a more uniform extinction pattern would be expected. Instead, survival appears to have been uneven and structured, suggesting that biological traits and ecological context played a role in determining outcomes. Timing also complicates a single cause explanation. While the asteroid impact coincides closely with the extinction boundary, fossil evidence indicates that not all groups declined simultaneously or at the same rate. Some lineages show signs of stress or reduced diversity before the boundary, while others remain stable until very near the end. This staggered pattern implies that extinction pressures were already operating prior to the final event. Another challenge comes from ecosystem response rather than immediate mortality.
The most severe consequences of the impact are thought to have occurred not in the moments or days following collision, but in the months and years afterward. Reduced sunlight, cooler global temperatures, and disrupted precipitation patterns would have altered ecosystems over extended periods. Survival under these conditions would have depended on an organism's ability to cope with prolonged resource scarcity, not simply to withstand an initial shock. Non-avian dinosaurs as a group were characterized by relatively large body sizes, long growth periods, and high energy demands. These traits are not problematic in stable environments, but they become liabilities when food webs are destabilized. In contrast, many of the groups that survived the boundary were smaller, more flexible in diet, or capable of using refuges that buffered them against environmental extremes. The marine fossil record provides an instructive parallel. In the oceans, the extinction pattern also shows selectivity. Some plankton groups were devastated, while others survived. Reef ecosystems collapsed, but certain deep-sea communities remained relatively stable. These patterns indicate that the extinction operated through ecological disruption rather than instantaneous universal lethality. Another important consideration is duration. If the asteroid were the sole cause, extinction would be expected to be geologically abrupt across all affected groups. While the boundary itself is sharp, the biological responses recorded in fossils suggest a more extended process, with cascading effects moving through ecosystems over time. This distinction matters because it points to mechanisms that unfold over years to centuries rather than seconds. There is also the question of resilience. Ecosystems can absorb shocks up to a point. Prior environmental stress can reduce that resilience, making systems more vulnerable to collapse when an additional disturbance occurs. This concept is well established in modern ecology and is increasingly applied to deep time events. If late Cretaceous ecosystems were already under strain, the asteroid impact would have acted not as an isolated cause, but as a tipping point. Importantly, recognizing the limits of the asteroid explanation does not diminish its importance. The impact remains the only event with clear global reach and precise timing at the extinction boundary. What it cannot explain alone is why extinction was total for non-avian dinosaurs but incomplete for many other groups. Scientific caution requires acknowledging this gap. Statements that attribute dinosaur extinction entirely to the asteroid oversimplify the evidence and obscure the role of longer-term processes.
Modern research increasingly frames the impact as a decisive trigger acting upon ecosystems that were already vulnerable. In this view, extinction is not the result of a single blow, but of interaction. A sudden environmental shock intersects with biological traits, ecological structure, and pre-existing stress. The outcome depends not only on the magnitude of the disturbance, but on the capacity of organisms and ecosystems to respond. Understanding why the asteroid alone is insufficient is therefore essential. It shifts the question from what killed the dinosaurs to why dinosaurs as a group could not recover. That distinction opens the door to examining additional factors that shaped the final outcome, factors that operated on longer timescales and set the stage for collapse. Long before the asteroid impact at the end of the Cretaceous, Earth was already undergoing profound environmental change driven by prolonged volcanic activity. One of the most significant expressions of this activity was the formation of the Deccan Traps, a vast volcanic province produced by repeated eruptions over hundreds of thousands of years. While these eruptions did not instantly eliminate non-avian dinosaurs, they likely altered the global environment in ways that reduced ecological stability and resilience.
The Deccan Traps consist of layered basalt flows that today cover large areas of western and central India. Radiometric dating indicates that the most intense phase of volcanism began in the late Cretaceous and continued across the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary. This timing is critical because it places sustained volcanic emissions both before and during the interval in which dinosaurs disappeared. Volcanic eruptions of this scale release enormous quantities of gases into the atmosphere, particularly carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide. Carbon dioxide is a long-lived greenhouse gas capable of driving global warming over extended periods. Sulfur dioxide, by contrast, can form sulfate aerosols that reflect sunlight, leading to short-term cooling and acid rain. The alternating dominance of these effects would have produced climatic instability rather than a single predictable trend. Geochemical records support this interpretation. Isotopic data from marine sediments indicate fluctuations in temperature and ocean chemistry during the late Cretaceous. These fluctuations are consistent with repeated injections of volcanic gases rather than a single catastrophic event. Such instability can disrupt ecosystems even if average conditions remain within tolerable ranges. On land, changes in temperature and precipitation patterns would have affected plant communities. Shifts in vegetation composition and productivity can ripple upward through food webs, influencing herbivores first and then the predators that depend on them. Importantly, these effects unfold over thousands to tens of thousands of years, slow enough that extinction may not be immediate, but persistent enough to erode ecological buffers. In the oceans, volcanic emissions may have contributed to acidification, stressing organisms that rely on calcium carbonate for shells and skeletons. Marine extinctions at the end of the Cretaceous show selectivity consistent with chemical stress rather than uniform collapse. This marine pattern parallels the selective nature of terrestrial extinctions and suggests a shared underlying vulnerability. A crucial point is that volcanic activity does not need to be lethal on its own to matter. Ecological systems can endure chronic stress for long periods, but their capacity to absorb additional shocks diminishes over time. Prolonged volcanism could have reduced biodiversity, simplified food webs, and narrowed the range of conditions under which ecosystems could function.
Evidence from dinosaur fossils themselves does not show a uniform global decline prior to the extinction. In some regions, dinosaur diversity appears stable until very late in the Cretaceous. In others, there are hints of reduced diversity or changes in community structure. This uneven pattern is consistent with regionally variable environmental stress rather than a single global cause. The role of Deccan volcanism, therefore, remains a subject of active scientific debate. Some researchers emphasize its potential to drive long-term climate change, while others argue that its effects were moderate compared to the asteroid impact. What is broadly accepted is that volcanism was not a background detail. It was a major Earth system process operating at exactly the wrong time. Importantly, volcanic activity and asteroid impact are not mutually exclusive explanations. They operate on different timescales and through different mechanisms. Volcanism acts slowly and persistently, reshaping climate and chemistry. An impact acts suddenly, delivering an abrupt shock. When combined, these forces can interact in ways that amplify biological consequences. From a systems perspective, the late Cretaceous may represent a world already under pressure. Volcanic emissions altered climate and environments over extended periods, pushing ecosystems closer to critical thresholds. When the asteroid impact occurred, it struck a biosphere that may have already been operating with reduced resilience. This framework helps explain why extinction was so severe for some groups and less so for others. Organisms adapted to stable conditions with high energy requirements and long generation times would have been particularly vulnerable. Those capable of rapid reproduction, flexible diets, or sheltering behaviors would have had a greater chance of persistence. In this light, Deccan volcanism is best understood not as a single cause of dinosaur extinction, but as a long-term stressor that shaped the context in which the final catastrophe unfolded. It weakened ecosystems, altered environmental baselines, and narrowed the margin for survival. Recognizing this role shifts the narrative away from a simple cause and effect story. The extinction of non-avian dinosaurs emerges instead as the outcome of interacting forces, some slow and persistent, others sudden and extreme, acting on a biosphere already under strain. Whether non-avian dinosaurs were already declining before the end Cretaceous extinction is one of the most debated questions in modern paleontology. The answer matters because it shapes how the final catastrophe is interpreted, as a sudden, overwhelming event that struck a thriving biosphere, or as a trigger that pushed already stressed ecosystems beyond recovery. Current evidence supports neither extreme fully. Some fossil data sets appear to show reduced dinosaur diversity in the final million years of the Cretaceous, particularly in parts of North America. Fewer species are recorded, and some well-known groups seem less abundant. At first glance, this pattern could suggest a gradual decline leading up to extinction. However, interpreting these data requires caution. The fossil record is not a complete census of past life. It is shaped by preservation bias, sampling effort, and geological exposure. Rocks of the very latest Cretaceous are unevenly distributed across the globe, and in many regions they are poorly exposed or heavily eroded. Where fewer fossils are found, it is not always clear whether fewer animals lived there or whether fewer fossils were preserved and discovered. When data from multiple continents are compared, the picture becomes more complex. In some regions, dinosaur diversity appears stable until very close to the boundary.
In others, diversity seems to fluctuate or decline. This geographic variability suggests that any pre-extinction stress was not uniform worldwide. Local environments may have experienced deterioration, while others remained relatively productive. Another line of evidence comes from ecological structure rather than raw species counts. Even if the number of dinosaur species remained relatively high, ecosystems could still have been vulnerable. Changes in vegetation, climate variability, or seasonal extremes can destabilize food webs without immediately causing extinction. Such stress may not register clearly as a decline in diversity, but can reduce resilience. Plant fossils provide important context. Pollen and spore records indicate shifts in plant communities during the late Cretaceous, including changes in dominant plant types and productivity in some regions. Because large herbivorous dinosaurs depended on continuous access to vegetation, even modest disruptions in plant communities could have had cascading effects. Importantly, there is no convincing evidence that non-avian dinosaurs were already doomed or inevitably heading toward extinction before the asteroid impact. Many groups show continuity in body size, geographic range, and ecological role up to the very end of the Cretaceous. This argues against a simple narrative of long-term decline. At the same time, the evidence does not support a perfectly stable world either. Climate proxies indicate fluctuations in temperature and sea level during the late Cretaceous. Combined with ongoing volcanic activity, these changes likely produced periods of environmental instability. Ecosystems experiencing repeated stress may function normally most of the time, while becoming increasingly sensitive to disruption. This distinction is crucial. A system can appear robust until it suddenly collapses when a threshold is crossed.
In such cases, the final trigger draws attention, but the underlying vulnerability is easy to overlook. Many modern ecological collapses follow this pattern, and there is no reason to assume deep-time ecosystems behaved differently. The fossil record therefore points to a nuanced conclusion. There is evidence for environmental stress and regional instability before the extinction, but not for a global, monotonic decline of dinosaurs as a group. Non-avian dinosaurs were widespread, diverse, and ecologically important until very near the end. This interpretation aligns with a multi-factor extinction model. Long-term environmental pressures may have reduced ecological margins, while the asteroid impact delivered an abrupt global disruption. Neither factor alone fully accounts for the outcome, but together they explain why recovery was impossible. Understanding this balance helps resolve a false dichotomy in extinction narratives. The question is not whether dinosaurs were thriving or failing, but how close ecosystems were to their limits. The evidence suggests they were operating with less flexibility than before, making them highly vulnerable to sudden change. In this context, the extinction of non-avian dinosaurs appears neither entirely sudden nor entirely gradual. It was the culmination of accumulating stress followed by a decisive shock. Recognizing this pattern allows the fossil record to be interpreted without forcing it into an overly simple story. Mass extinctions are not defined solely by dramatic events, but by what happens to energy as it moves through ecosystems. At the end of the Cretaceous, the decisive pressure on non-avian dinosaurs was not simply physical destruction, but the breakdown of food webs that sustained large-bodied life.
This collapse unfolded over time and affected organisms differently depending on their position within those webs. All terrestrial ecosystems ultimately depend on primary productivity, plants converting sunlight into chemical energy.
Multiple lines of evidence indicate that this foundation was severely disrupted at the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary. Following the asteroid impact, atmospheric dust, aerosols, and sulfur compounds likely reduced incoming sunlight for extended periods. Even partial reductions in light can significantly suppress photosynthesis, especially across large geographic areas. Plant fossil records support a sharp decline in productivity. Pollen and spore assemblages show abrupt changes, with some regions recording a temporary dominance of hardy, fast-growing plants that tolerate disturbance. This pattern suggests that complex plant communities collapsed and were replaced with simpler, opportunistic vegetation. Such communities can stabilize soil and persist through harsh conditions, but they do not provide the same quantity or quality of biomass required by large herbivores. For herbivorous dinosaurs, this represented a critical bottleneck. Large body size demands a steady and substantial intake of energy. When plant availability becomes unpredictable or insufficient, large herbivores face immediate constraints. Unlike smaller animals, they cannot easily switch diets, exploit refuges, or survive on limited resources for long periods. Even if some vegetation remained, its distribution and nutritional value may not have supported viable populations. The consequences for carnivorous dinosaurs followed inevitably. Predators depend on prey populations not just in number, but in stability. As herbivores declined or fragmented into smaller, isolated groups, large carnivores would have encountered increasing difficulty meeting their energetic needs. Importantly, this problem does not require predators to starve immediately. Reduced reproductive success and increased juvenile mortality alone can drive populations toward extinction over relatively short timescales. This cascading effect is well documented in modern ecological collapses. When primary producers fail, losses propagate upward through trophic levels, often with a delay. Apex consumers are frequently the last to decline, but also the least likely to recover once populations fall below critical thresholds. Non-avian dinosaurs occupied many of these upper trophic positions, making them particularly vulnerable to prolonged disruption. The duration of the disruption matters. A brief environmental shock can be survived if conditions quickly return to normal. The evidence at the end of the Cretaceous suggests that recovery was slow and uneven. Climate models indicate extended cooling, altered precipitation patterns, and seasonal extremes persisting for years to decades. During this time, ecosystems would have remained simplified and unstable. Smaller animals fared better under these conditions. Species with lower absolute energy requirements, flexible diets, and faster reproductive cycles could exploit transient resources and rebound more quickly. Mammals, many reptiles, and avian dinosaurs fall into this category. Their survival does not imply that conditions were mild, only that they were tolerable for organisms with different biological constraints. Another factor is spatial fragmentation. As ecosystems broke apart, suitable habitats may have become patchy and disconnected. Large dinosaurs with extensive home ranges would have struggled to move between shrinking resource patches.
Smaller animals could persist in microhabitats or refuges that were inaccessible or inadequate for larger species. Crucially, this food web collapse does not require a single uniform mechanism. Volcanic emissions, climate fluctuations, and the asteroid impact all contributed to instability in primary productivity. Their combined effects reduced energy flow at the base of ecosystems and prevented rapid recovery. Once this occurred, extinction became a matter of time rather than chance. This perspective reframes the extinction of non-avian dinosaurs as a systemic failure. It was not that dinosaurs were uniquely fragile, but that their ecological roles demanded stable, high-throughput energy systems. When those systems failed, the traits that had once made dinosaurs successful became liabilities. Understanding extinction through energy flow also explains selectivity. It clarifies why large-bodied, specialized animals disappeared, while smaller, more flexible organisms survived.
It aligns terrestrial and marine patterns, where collapses in primary productivity likewise preceded losses among higher trophic levels. In the end, the disappearance of non-avian dinosaurs reflects the limits of recovery in a destabilized world. The asteroid impact and long-term environmental stress disrupted the flow of energy through ecosystems. Once that flow was broken, large dinosaurs could not sustain viable populations long enough to recover. This food web perspective does not replace other explanations, it integrates them. It shows how different pressures converged on a single vulnerability, the dependence of large dinosaurs on stable, productive ecosystems. When that stability vanished, extinction followed not as an instant event, but as an unavoidable outcome. Body size is one of the most powerful determinants of how an organism interacts with its environment. Under stable conditions, large size can confer clear advantages: resistance to predators, efficient long-distance movement, and the ability to process large quantities of low-quality food. For much of the Mesozoic era, these advantages helped non-avian dinosaurs dominate terrestrial ecosystems. After the end Cretaceous environmental collapse, however, the same trait became a critical liability. Large animals operate under strict biological constraints. They require substantial and continuous energy input to maintain basic metabolism, growth, and reproduction. Even short interruptions in food supply can have outsized effects. In a world where primary productivity was reduced and unpredictable, this dependence on steady energy flow placed large dinosaurs at a severe disadvantage. Growth rate is a key factor. Many large non-avian dinosaurs took years to reach reproductive maturity. Fossil bone histology indicates prolonged growth periods compared to small vertebrates. When environments are disrupted, species with long generation times recover more slowly. Population declines caused by even modest increases in juvenile mortality or decreases in reproductive success can become irreversible before recovery is possible. Body size is one of the most powerful determinants of how an organism interacts with its environment. Under stable conditions, large size can confer clear advantages: resistance to predators, efficient long-distance movement, and the ability to process large quantities of low-quality food. For much of the Mesozoic era, these advantages helped non-avian dinosaurs dominate terrestrial ecosystems.
After the end Cretaceous environmental collapse, however, the same trait became a critical liability. Large dinosaurs produced relatively few offspring compared to small-bodied animals. Even though some species laid multiple eggs, survival rates from egg to adulthood were likely low under stressed conditions. In unstable environments, high offspring mortality cannot be compensated for quickly when generation times are long. Mobility also changes meaning after ecological collapse. Large dinosaurs often required extensive home ranges to meet their energetic needs. As productive habitats became fragmented, moving between suitable areas would have become increasingly difficult. Smaller animals, by contrast, could persist within limited refuges, exploiting microhabitats that large-bodied species could not use effectively. Thermoregulation may have further amplified these challenges. Regardless of whether non-avian dinosaurs were fully endothermic, ectothermic, or occupied an intermediate metabolic state, large body mass limits how quickly an organism can respond to rapid temperature changes. Extended periods of cooling or extreme seasonal variation would have placed additional physiological stress on large animals with limited capacity for rapid adjustment. Importantly, none of these constraints imply that large dinosaurs were poorly adapted or inefficient under normal conditions. Their success over tens of millions of years demonstrates the opposite. The problem was not their size itself, but the mismatch between that size and the altered post-extinction environment. This pattern is not unique to dinosaurs. Modern mass extinctions and ecological collapses show similar selectivity. Large-bodied species with specialized diets and slow reproductive rates are consistently more vulnerable to sustained environmental disruption. The fossil record of the end Cretaceous extinction fits this broader biological principle. Small-bodied survivors benefited from a different set of traits. Lower absolute energy requirements, faster reproduction, and greater ecological flexibility allowed them to endure prolonged instability. These advantages did not guarantee survival, but they increased the range of conditions under which survival was possible.
The extinction of non-avian dinosaurs, therefore, reflects a shift in selective pressures rather than a sudden failure of adaptation. Traits that once supported dominance became liabilities when environmental conditions crossed critical thresholds. Once populations declined below sustainable levels, recovery was unlikely, even if conditions later improved. Understanding the role of body size helps explain why extinction patterns were consistent across continents and ecosystems. It also clarifies why survival was not random. The disappearance of non-avian dinosaurs followed predictable biological rules that apply across time and taxa. In this sense, large body size did not doom dinosaurs on its own. It became fatal only when combined with prolonged disruption of food webs, climate instability, and ecological fragmentation. The extinction was not a punishment for being large, but a consequence of being large in a world that could no longer support large life. The survival of birds across the end Cretaceous extinction is one of the most consequential outcomes in the history of life. Birds are not a separate group that merely coexisted with dinosaurs. They are dinosaurs. The extinction therefore did not eliminate all dinosaurs, but selectively removed all non-avian lineages.
Understanding why this single branch survived requires careful attention to biology, ecology, and constraint, without assuming any single winning trait. First, size mattered, but only in context. The birds that crossed the boundary were small-bodied. This reduced absolute energy requirements and allowed survival on limited and fluctuating resources. In a world where primary productivity collapsed and food webs were simplified, small size increased the range of tolerable conditions. However, small size alone does not explain survival. Many small-bodied non-avian dinosaurs still disappeared. Dietary flexibility appears to have played a role.
Evidence from beak morphology, jaw mechanics, and comparative anatomy suggests that early birds were capable of exploiting a range of food sources, including seeds and other durable plant materials. Such resources can persist when fresh vegetation and complex ecosystems fail. Importantly, this does not mean birds were immune to scarcity, but that their feeding options were broader under crisis conditions. Reproductive strategy also influenced outcomes. Birds produce eggs and develop rapidly relative to large non-avian dinosaurs. Faster generation times allow populations to rebound more quickly after declines. When environments are unstable, the ability to replace lost individuals becomes critical. Species with long maturation times cannot compensate for losses before populations fall below viable thresholds. Locomotion and habitat use further shaped survival probabilities. The capacity for flight, or at least for efficient movement across fragmented landscapes, would have allowed birds to access dispersed resources and refuges. Even limited flight capability could expand foraging range and facilitate escape from local environmental stress. This advantage should not be overstated. Flight does not confer immunity to extinction, but in combination with other traits, it widened ecological options. Physiological flexibility likely contributed as well. While the exact metabolic states of early birds remain debated, their small size would have allowed more rapid physiological responses to temperature variation. In contrast, large-bodied dinosaurs experienced slower thermal and metabolic adjustment. Extended cooling or extreme seasonality would therefore have imposed less stress on small avian dinosaurs than on larger relatives. Another critical factor is nesting and life history timing. Birds that nested in protected environments or exploited short breeding windows may have reduced exposure of eggs and juveniles to prolonged environmental stress. This advantage would have been subtle but cumulative, improving survival odds across multiple breeding cycles in a destabilized world.
It is also essential to recognize what did not guarantee survival. Birds did not survive because they were inherently superior, more intelligent, or uniquely resilient. Many bird lineages still went extinct at the boundary. Survival was selective even within avian dinosaurs. The groups that endured happened to possess a combination of traits compatible with post-extinction conditions. From a systems perspective, avian survival reflects compatibility with a simplified biosphere. The post-extinction world favored organisms that could tolerate scarcity, exploit generalized resources, and reproduce quickly. Birds fit this profile better than large, specialized, non-avian dinosaurs. This compatibility, rather than any single adaptation, explains persistence. The survival of birds, therefore, does not contradict the severity of the extinction. It illustrates how extinction filters life through constraint. Traits that matter little in stable ecosystems become decisive under collapse. Birds passed through that filter, other dinosaurs did not. Understanding avian survival reframes the extinction as a selective process rather than a total annihilation. It also underscores a broader principle in evolutionary biology. Survival during crises depends less on dominance under normal conditions and more on flexibility when conditions deteriorate. At first glance, ecological diversity should have offered protection. By the end of the Cretaceous, non-avian dinosaurs occupied a wide range of environments and ecological roles. There were large and small species, herbivores and carnivores, animals adapted to forests, floodplains, coastal regions, and inland basins. In many extinction scenarios, such diversity increases the chance that at least some lineages will survive. In the case of non-avian dinosaurs, it did not. The key reason lies in how diversity was structured. Although dinosaurs were ecologically varied, most non-avian lineages shared a set of underlying biological constraints. Large body size was common, even among species that differed in diet or habitat.
Long growth periods, delayed reproduction, and high energy requirements characterized much of the group. Ecological variety existed, but it was built upon a relatively narrow biological foundation. When environmental conditions deteriorate gradually, diversity can buffer ecosystems. Different species respond differently to stress, preventing synchronized collapse. However, when disruption is rapid, global, and prolonged, shared vulnerabilities become more important than surface-level differences. The end Cretaceous crisis combined both sudden shock and long-term instability, reducing the effectiveness of ecological diversification as a protective factor. Habitat diversity also proved insufficient. Many non-avian dinosaurs occupied inland environments, far from the immediate effects of coastal tsunamis or wildfires. Others lived near river systems or wetlands. Yet the most damaging consequences of the extinction were not localized physical disturbances. They were global disruptions to climate and energy flow. Reduced sunlight, altered precipitation, and collapsing plant productivity affected all terrestrial habitats, regardless of geography. Dietary diversity faced similar limits. Herbivorous dinosaurs consumed different types of vegetation, and carnivorous dinosaurs targeted different prey, but nearly all depended, directly or indirectly, on a productive plant base. When primary productivity declined, differences in feeding strategy mattered less than the shared dependence on abundant biomass. Ecological specialization became a liability rather than a safeguard. Another important factor is population structure. Many non-avian dinosaurs likely existed at relatively low population densities spread across large areas. Such populations are inherently vulnerable to fragmentation. As ecosystems broke apart, isolated groups may have fallen below viable population sizes. Once genetic exchange ceased and reproduction declined, extinction could occur even if small pockets of suitable habitat remained. Ecological diversity also does not imply functional redundancy. In modern ecosystems, multiple species can sometimes perform similar ecological roles, allowing systems to persist even when some species disappear.
Among non-avian dinosaurs, redundancy appears to have been limited.
The loss of a major herbivore lineage, for example, could not easily be compensated for by another species with similar ecological function, especially under conditions of reduced productivity. By contrast, many surviving groups exhibited both biological and ecological flexibility. Small mammals, birds, and some reptiles occupied niches that could shift rapidly as conditions changed. Their diversity was not just a matter of different roles, but of different strategies for survival under stress. The fossil record supports this interpretation. Extinction among non-avian dinosaurs was not selective by habitat, diet, or region. It was nearly total across all ecological categories. Such a pattern is consistent with a global filter acting on shared constraints rather than on individual lifestyles. This does not mean diversity was irrelevant. It shaped how dinosaurs functioned within ecosystems and how those ecosystems responded to stress. But it was not the type of diversity that confers resilience under extreme, prolonged disruption. Diversity without flexibility is fragile when conditions cross critical thresholds. Understanding this point helps explain why extinction narratives focused solely on specialists versus generalists are incomplete. Many dinosaurs were successful specialists in stable environments. What they lacked as a group was the capacity to rapidly reorganize life histories in response to collapse. The failure of ecological diversity to protect non-avian dinosaurs underscores a central theme of the end Cretaceous extinction. Survival was not determined by how many roles a group occupied, but whether its underlying biology allowed adaptation to a simplified, unstable world. The extinction of non-avian dinosaurs is often imagined as an instantaneous global event, an abrupt end marked by a single line in the geological record. While the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary itself is sharp in stratigraphic terms, the biological reality recorded by fossils is more complex.
Extinction unfolded unevenly across regions, environments, and timescales, reflecting how different ecosystems responded to overlapping stresses. From a geological perspective, the boundary layer represents a moment in time. From a biological perspective, extinction is a process. Populations decline, fragment, and fail to recover over generations. Fossils capture snapshots of this process rather than a continuous record. As a result, extinction appears abrupt in some datasets and more gradual in others. Regional variation is one of the clearest signals of this unevenness. In some areas, dinosaur fossils remain abundant until very close to the boundary. In others, apparent declines occur earlier. This discrepancy does not necessarily mean dinosaurs disappeared at different times worldwide. Instead, it reflects differences in sedimentation, preservation, and sampling. Some regions preserve late Cretaceous ecosystems well, others do not. Environmental context also mattered. Ecosystems differ in productivity, stability, and buffering capacity. Regions with more resilient plant communities or favorable local conditions may have sustained dinosaur populations slightly longer. Conversely, areas already stressed by climate variability, sea level change, or volcanic influence may have experienced earlier ecological breakdown. The fossil record of plants and small animals reinforces this picture. In many regions, plant communities show abrupt collapse, followed by recovery dominated by opportunistic species.
In others, changes appear more gradual. These differences suggest that the severity and duration of post-impact environmental effects varied geographically. Temporal resolution further complicates interpretation. Fossil layers representing thousands of years can appear compressed into thin strata. A population decline unfolding over centuries may be indistinguishable from a sudden disappearance when viewed through the lens of deep time. What appears as a single moment of extinction may encompass multiple ecological phases. This unevenness helps explain why some non-avian dinosaur fossils appear slightly above or below the expected boundary in certain regions. Such occurrences are often cited as contradictions, but they usually reflect dating uncertainty, reworking of sediments, or local preservation quirks, rather than true survival beyond the extinction event. Importantly, uneven extinction does not weaken the case for a global catastrophe. Instead, it clarifies how global events interact with local conditions. A worldwide disturbance does not produce identical outcomes everywhere. It interacts with regional ecosystems, producing variable responses that converge toward a common outcome: extinction. Understanding extinction as uneven also aligns with modern ecological observations. Large-scale environmental crises today do not eliminate species everywhere at once. Populations decline at different rates, depending on habitat, connectivity, and resilience. The end Cretaceous extinction appears to have followed similar principles, albeit on a far greater scale. For non-avian dinosaurs, uneven decline meant that some populations may have persisted briefly in refugial environments, while others vanished rapidly. However, persistence is not survival. Without long-term recovery, isolated populations eventually disappear. The fossil record suggests that no non-avian dinosaur lineage achieved sustained recovery after the boundary, regardless of short-term regional persistence. This perspective reconciles seemingly conflicting evidence. It allows for both a sharp boundary signal and a biologically extended extinction process. It also reinforces the importance of viewing extinction through ecological dynamics rather than through a single dramatic event. Ultimately, uneven extinction emphasizes that the end of non-avian dinosaurs was not a synchronized disappearance, but a convergence toward loss driven by shared vulnerabilities. Different paths led to the same outcome. Recognizing this complexity brings the scientific narrative closer to what the evidence actually supports. After decades of research, the extinction of non-avian dinosaurs remains one of the most intensively studied events in Earth history. Yet, despite the volume of data, science does not provide a single, closed narrative.
Instead, it offers a framework of constraints: what the evidence supports, what it rules out, and where uncertainty remains. Understanding these boundaries is essential to avoiding oversimplification. Science can state with high confidence that a large asteroid impact occurred at the end of the Cretaceous and that its timing coincides closely with the disappearance of non-avian dinosaurs. Geological markers, radiometric dating, and global stratigraphic signals converge on this conclusion. The impact had severe environmental consequences, including disruption of climate and primary productivity.
These facts are not in serious dispute. Science can also state that this impact did not act in isolation. Long-term volcanic activity, climate variability, and ecological stress were already present before the boundary. Evidence from multiple proxies indicates that late Cretaceous ecosystems were dynamic and, in some regions, unstable. These pressures likely reduced resilience, making ecosystems more vulnerable to sudden disturbance. What science can say, therefore, is that extinction resulted from interacting factors operating across different timescales. A sudden global shock intersected with longer-term environmental stress and biological constraints. This interaction explains both the severity of extinction among non-avian dinosaurs and the survival of other groups. At the same time, there are clear limits to what science can claim. Fossils do not record behavior, decision-making, or moment-to-moment responses to crisis. They cannot tell us how individual animals experienced the final years of the Cretaceous. They cannot identify a precise sequence of deaths or a single moment when extinction became inevitable. Science also cannot assign a single exclusive cause. Statements such as "the asteroid killed the dinosaurs" are shorthand, not complete explanations. They omit the roles of volcanic emissions, climate feedbacks, ecological collapse, and biological vulnerability. Such simplifications are useful for communication, but misleading if taken literally. Another limit lies in resolution. Geological time compresses events that unfolded over decades, centuries, or millennia into thin layers of rock. What appears sudden in the stratigraphic record may represent a drawn-out biological process. Science can infer rates and patterns, but it cannot fully reconstruct their temporal detail. There are also uncertainties in data coverage. The fossil record is uneven across continents and environments. Some regions preserve late Cretaceous ecosystems well, others do not. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, and scientific conclusions must account for this bias. Importantly, science cannot say that non-avian dinosaurs were destined to go extinct regardless of the impact. Nor can it say they would certainly have survived without it. Counterfactual scenarios lie beyond empirical testing. What science can do is evaluate plausibility based on known constraints, not rewrite history. What emerges from these limits is not weakness, but discipline. Scientific explanations gain strength by acknowledging uncertainty rather than erasing it. The extinction of non-avian dinosaurs is understood not as a solved puzzle with missing pieces filled by imagination, but as a complex event constrained by evidence and open to refinement. This disciplined uncertainty has broader significance. It shows how extinction operates not as a singular event, but as a process shaped by thresholds. Ecosystems can absorb stress until they cannot. When multiple pressures converge, collapse can occur rapidly, even if no single factor is sufficient on its own. In this sense, the extinction of non-avian dinosaurs is not merely a story about the past. It is a case study in how biological systems respond to compounded environmental change. It demonstrates that dominance under stable conditions does not guarantee survival under crisis, and that resilience depends on flexibility, not scale. Science can therefore say why non-avian dinosaurs disappeared in general terms, but not in exhaustive detail.
It can identify the forces involved and the constraints that shaped outcomes. It cannot offer a single cause, a single moment, or a single lesson that applies universally. The most accurate conclusion is also the most restrained. Non-avian dinosaurs went extinct because a series of environmental stresses culminated in a global ecological collapse that exceeded their capacity to recover. That collapse unfolded unevenly, selectively, and irreversibly. Accepting this conclusion means accepting the limits of certainty. The story of dinosaur extinction is not finished because science does not close questions prematurely. It remains open not because the evidence is weak, but because the event itself was complex. In recognizing what science can and cannot say, we gain a clearer view not only of how dinosaurs disappeared, but of how knowledge itself advances, carefully, provisionally, and always within the bounds set by evidence.